Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 247, and this is for Class 4 Tuesday, the 9th of June. This puts us into the beginning of week 4 of the summer session, or if we were in a traditional academic semester, this would put us into week 8, which is approximately midway through the semester, believe it or not. And as you know, we started the semester with the Cult of True Womanhood so that we could get a background as to what life might have been like in the 1800s. And it was in the Cult of True Womanhood that I chose your paper topic. So I had discussed this a couple of videos back that your paper topic has been uploaded into the syllabus and other documents folder. And the paper topic is a quotation that I took from the Cult of True Womanhood, asking you to use that quotation to respond to one of the texts that we would be reading this semester. And basically, you have the same prompt for both papers, paper number 1 and paper number 2. But paper number 1 would be due approximately midway through the semester, and it would be addressing one of the earlier texts of the semester. Paper number 2 would be the same prompt, but addressing one of the later texts of the semester. And the quotation is about how a girl could be ruined by a book that either attacked or seemed to attack a woman's accepted role in society. And all of the texts that we are going to be reading this semester do that in different ways, some more obvious than others. Now, this is not to say that you can't choose your own paper topic, but if you were to choose your own paper topic, then you want to get that topic approved by me, and it has to be about one of the texts we've read this semester. So we started with the story of an hour. So it is possible to write a paper about a short story, but you're going to have to do a very detailed analysis because a story of an hour is just about a page and a half long, as opposed to Frankenstein, which was a full-length novel. And when we were talking about Frankenstein, one of the things we talked about was its format as an epistolary novel. And in reviewing the discussion question responses, I just wanted to make sure that everybody was clear that the epistolary novel is when you get information in a series of letters. But in this particular instance, the information is coming from one character and one character only. That is Walton. So Walton is giving us Victor's story as Walton remembers hearing it. And Victor is giving Walton the creature story as Victor remembers hearing it. And in the end, we can rely on only one narrative, and that is Walton. It is quite possible, because this deliberate ambiguity is inserted in the text, which is not uncommon in Gothic literature, that we are getting a corrupted narrative from Victor. Victor may not even exist. And the same goes for the creature. And that leads to some questions as to why Victor and Walton have so many similarities. And you've probably noticed that Victor and the creature also have many similarities, which is also an element of Gothic literature that you will see a kind of doubling. It's known as a doppelganger. And that said, usually we leave the idea of the epistolary novel and its ambiguity to talk about some of the themes of the text. And I can't help think about one of the major themes of Frankenstein, the dangers of science run amok when the hubris of scientists gets in the way of what's moral or ethical. Thinking about some of the contemporary concerns we have in our society, and certainly Mary Shelley couldn't have known about things like artificial insemination, or more contemporary things like artificial intelligence. But certainly many questions that are similar are raised, getting down to the phrase that just because something can be done, it doesn't necessarily mean something should be done. And we know that ultimately what Victor does is terms of his neglect of duty is twofold. The first is that he creates life from death, trying to usurp the power of a god. And the second is where he tries to negate any responsibility for his creation. And we see the consequences thereof. And as we had talked about, although Frankenstein is a text that's written by a female author, we've got a very male centric story. And I think that part of the message within the story is some of the negatives that can occur when female is excluded from society and is not given voice or autonomy. That said, you could look at female characters like Elizabeth, and Elizabeth does fit into that stereotypical role of the cult of true womanhood. Yet there are other characters like Justine who doesn't necessarily fit into that stereotypical role. Perhaps she could be an element for you to discuss about how a girl could be ruined by a book. Or the idea if a female were reading this book and realizing that these are the negative consequences with the absence of female, that in and of itself is a rather revolutionary idea for the time period. Or the fact that Mother Nature plays such a prominent role and Mother Nature is seen as the feminine, the divine feminine, which is something that we will talk about with our third text, and that happens to be Jane Eyre. It is the longest of the texts, but I can tell you that it's going to move much more quickly than Persuasion is, just because it's a text that's filled with action. Persuasion is a much slower text, and I'm hopeful that either you have finished Persuasion or you are close to finishing Persuasion at this point, because of course Persuasion could be another option for your paper topic. And in Persuasion, we have a central female narrator, Anne Elliot. Now, Anne might not seem to be terribly powerful or terribly in some ways or another different from what could be experienced in the cult of true womanhood. But the ability for Anne to be able to serve as a keen observer of some of the absurdities of her society, which are related as much to class as they are to gender, is really the way to read this particular book. We're not supposed to like the Elliot family. The Elliot family is supposed to be a microcosm of the world of the landed gentry. Not necessarily royalty, but a step below that. Remember, we're talking about British society. So when we are talking about British society, we're talking about a society that very much is concerned with rank, with station, and with appearances, especially in the 1800s when we're talking about the Victorian period. So definitely read this text as a satire against this world. It's also a romance, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why the author was able to produce a text such as this, because in some ways it does follow the stereotypical idea of romance. And in addition to learning about the manners and the decorum of the time period, we also learn about the importance of balance and compromise. So when you've got something that occurs in the text, for instance, if somebody were to fall, and that happens several times in the text, it's all a question of getting back to the importance of balance, that you don't want to have extremes. And this is something that I think most, if not all, literature reinforces. And of course, the text is trying to persuade us of this, but we know that the plot device is that Anne was persuaded from following her heart and marrying the man that she wanted to marry, and we see in the novel the consequences that unfold because of that. Marriage was very much a economic and a political union, less so one based on romantic attachment. The idea that romantic attachment would happen after marriage, not necessarily before marriage. And this is particularly important for the landed gentry so that they can retain their status in society. So they would need to marry somebody that was equal or better, somebody who was superior in status, especially the female, because this is ultimately how the female could gain economic and social power in her society. Now, I suggested that with Persuasion, because there are so many titles and so many names that are similar, that you might want to keep a chart of all of the characters. And what I've done in the notes below, as you can see, is I've divided up the characters into gender. There are lots of different ways that you could divide up these characters. But since this is a class about gender, I thought it would make sense to divide up the novel in that way. And in terms of the major male characters, obviously Sir Walter Elliot is the major character here. He's the father of the women that we're going to be reading about. He is a widower. And the central question here, or one of the central questions, is will he remarry? Because if he does remarry, that's going to change the entire dynamic of the inheritance, especially or particularly if he were to have heirs with his new wife. At this point, he's left with only daughters, which at the time period would be very problematic. So it is assumed that the estate is going to go to the nearest male relative. That happens to be a cousin of the family. And at the time, it was not unusual for cousins to marry. No, we talked a little bit about Elizabeth and Victor, who aren't in Frankenstein, who aren't blood related, but they seem to be like cousins or even brother and sister in the way that they were raised. But it was legitimately valid to marry a blood cousin. In fact, I believe it still is in some states in the United States. So that subtext is going on about what Sir Walter is going to be doing and what's going to be happening with his estate. Some of the other male characters, and notice, by the way, that Sir Walter has a title of Sir. So it's a term that we use every day very informally, but this meant something. It meant a certain status and rank in English society. Another male character is Charles Musgrove. Now, Charles Musgrove, notice he doesn't have the title of Sir. He's married to Sir Walter's youngest daughter, Mary. Sir Walter has 3 daughters. And it's odd that the youngest would be married and the other 2 aren't. So there's that tension and that subtext, especially because they're all nearing their late 20s. Charles Musgrove had once courted Anne Elliot and even proposed to her, and she turned him down. So he married, almost as a consolation, if you will, Anne Elliot's sister, Mary. So you can imagine the romantic rivalry and subtext in this particular situation. Another male character who's going to be very important in this book is Frederick Wentworth. Notice Frederick's last name, Wentworth. He went out and found his worth. Basically, he joined the military, the Navy, and was able to do quite well for himself by earning a rank through effort, not through birthright. And that also is a major tension in the novel, is that whether or not individuals should have the opportunity and the ability to raise their station based on education and based on profession. And actually, Sir Walter has quite a few interesting comments about that. But Frederick Wentworth is Anne Elliot's former suitor. Notice no title. At the time, he had no rank. The time, he had no money. And this is one of the reasons why Anne was persuaded to not accept his proposal. Anne has come to regret that to this day and has not married. And Frederick Wentworth has not married, but he's made it very clear now that he has returned back to town that he feels that it's time. It's the right time. It's the right place. And more importantly, he's achieved a certain level of economic and social stability, which makes him a good catch, if you will. William Elliot Esquire. He is the cousin in the Elliot family who is thought to be the heir presumptive, the heir who will be inheriting Sir Walter's estate unless Sir Walter were to marry and have another heir. And Walter Elliot Esquire, he's an attorney, so he's an esquire, but he doesn't have the rank of a sir, for instance. Eventually, he's going to be trying to court Anne as the novel progresses. We have a Mr. Musgrove. Remember, we talked about Charles Musgrove, who is married to Sir Walter's youngest daughter. Mr. Musgrove is the father to Charles Musgrove. Again, no titles. So it's just a Mr. at this point. Admiral Croft, we are introduced through the unfortunate situation that William Elliot finds himself in financially to the military subplot that we are going to be getting in the Navy. Admiral Croft is, and notice he has the rank of admiral, so he does have a kind of title, but it's not one through birthright. He rents Kellynch Hall, which is the Elliot estate. He rents it from Sir Walter because the beginning of the novel, we see that Sir Walter has a difficulty. Sir Walter obviously has a certain status and he needs to maintain a certain lifestyle, or so he believes, to live up to that status. But the problem is that he's gotten in a great deal of debt and he needs to repay his debts. And this is the major conflict that begins the story with Anne, who is the level-headed one of the family, suggesting that they cut as many expenses as possible to pay off the debt as quickly as possible. However, other family members are suggesting that they don't have to go to such extremes, and Sir Walter is very concerned about appearances and what will other people think. So he comes up with a plan with the family attorney that they are going to rent out the estate because they are going to be traveling and vacationing in Bath, a very common vacation spot. So he's renting it out, not necessarily because he needs money, but because he's not going to be there. And he would rent out only to a very limited number of people, assuming that they had the appropriate rank and the appropriate station. And that's exactly what he finds with Admiral Croft, who is married to Mrs. Croft, and there are no children, so he doesn't have to worry about, let's say, some of the damage that could occur to the estate if there were children involved. And that relationship is quite interesting. Admiral Croft and Mrs. Croft, who seem to have married for love and romance, not necessarily for money or for procreation, which is what the assumption would have been during the time. And because of Admiral Croft and Wentworth, we find other characters who are associated with the military. It turns out that Wentworth is the brother of Mrs. Croft. How convenient, eh? But remember that this was a time period where you didn't necessarily have easy travel in the way that we do today. So you usually lived in a very small circle. It was difficult traveling. You had to travel by horse and buggy. You couldn't take, let's say, automobiles. You couldn't take planes. So it was a big deal to be able to travel or to be introduced to somebody new into your social circle, because usually most of the people you knew were within close geographic proximity. Those would be the people you would socialize with. Ultimately, one of those people would be the person that you would marry and mate with, and so forth and so on. So we end up learning about Captain Harville, which is a friend of Frederick Wentworth's. He's married to Mrs. Harville. And they happen to be hosting a Captain Benwick, another captain, who is unmarried. So if you've got an eligible bachelor, the major question is, who are they going to marry? And Captain Harville's friend, Captain Benwick, has an interesting story because Captain Benwick was engaged to Captain Harville's sister, but she died. And the question, or one of the questions, is how long is appropriate for Benwick to grieve before he moves on to someone else? Again, this is a society that's filled with status. And then lastly, Charles Hayter. Notice there is no title here, no admiral, no sir. Charles Hayter is a Musgrove family cousin. He's single. He's courting one of the one of the Musgrove daughters, Henrietta. And he's entering into the clergy. And this was another way to gain a certain level of respect, not necessarily income, but a certain level of respect. So that could be considered an appropriate match, because this entire story is about what is an appropriate match. When we contrast this world of dinner parties and status and appearances to the world of, let's say, Jane Eyre, who is an orphan and poverty-stricken, we can definitely see the contrast that existed in society. And then we can add to that Harriet Jacobs, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and talk about how slavery was alive and well during this time period. During the same time period when Anne Elliot is wondering who she should marry. So that might give you a sense of context as to what was going on during this time period. In terms of the female characters, and again, you can divide these characters up in lots of different ways. There is Elizabeth Elliot, that's Sir Walter Elliot's oldest daughter, currently not courting anybody. And again, that would normally be of concern, except that it seems that Elizabeth Elliot has sort of taken on the role of Sir Walter's dearly departed wife. She's running the household. So Sir Walter isn't too concerned about the fact that his older daughter isn't married because she's basically serving a purpose, which is caring for him. If this sounds a little hypocritical to you, yes, this is a society of hypocrisy. Of course, there's Anne Elliot. She is the middle daughter, and the question is, who would ever want to court Anne because she's, quote, past her bloom, unquote, and that she's getting older. Certainly not as old as Elizabeth, but older in the sense that she no longer has youthful beauty. And part of this novel is about the importance of beauty for female in society. But even Sir Walter is extremely concerned with the idea of appearances in society. And will anyone ever want to court Anne? Anne has a middle daughter too. I think it's quite interesting because oftentimes in a sibling relationship where you've got a middle child, that middle child oftentimes gets lost between the elder child, who oftentimes is given lots of responsibility and respect, and the youngest child, who's oftentimes spoiled and given a lot of permissiveness. So Anne is, in some ways, the invisible one. We learn about Mary Musgrove, which I had mentioned earlier. This is Sir Walter's youngest daughter. It's the youngest daughter of all of the daughters who's married, and her marriage is fine. She didn't necessarily improve her status by marrying Charles Musgrove, but she didn't reduce her status by marrying into the Musgrove family either. Lady Russell is a central character in this text. Notice she has the title of Lady, which would be comparable to Sir. And Lady Russell is widowed, just like Sir Walter Elliot. And there never really is any conversation about whether or not Lady Russell will remarry. And if you remember the story of an hour, we had talked about that if a woman were to become a widow and there weren't any direct heirs, she would inherit the estate and could be in a very good place financially and socially. And that there would perhaps be less incentive to remarry and lose that power and control that she has. And Sir Walter, more of an incentive to remarry because he could retain the power and control and also produce heirs. So that would be the difference in widowhood between a male and a female, oftentimes in this society. Lady Russell is a good family friend and is serving as a kind of mother figure for Anne. One of the themes that you will see that will hold throughout the semester is that we will oftentimes see motherless characters. I didn't plan it this way. It just happened coincidentally, but happenstance or not, I think it's an important theme about how it is central to have a female figure in one's life and how the absence of a female figure, such as a mother, affects an individual negatively. Lady Russell is taking over as the kind of matriarch for the family now that uh, Sir Walter Elliot's wife has passed away. Lady Russell has only good intentions for Anne and supports Anne oftentimes when the family does not. But it was Lady Russell, amongst others, who suggested to Anne that she not marry Frederick Wentworth so many years ago because he didn't have status and he didn't have money. And one of the things we'll see is Lady Russell's transformation over the course of the novel and some of her regret about that level of persuasion, as the title, that she exerted on Anne Elliot. We have Mrs. Musgrove, and this is Charles Musgrove's mother. She's married to the Mr. Musgrove. We have Louisa Musgrove, which is one of the Musgrove daughters. She's the sister, of course, to Charles. And she is single. So, again, the idea is she's a pretty good match. Who will she marry? She's courted by Wentworth for a while, and he admires her for her strong will, something that Anne didn't necessarily show years ago when he asked Anne to marry him, and she refused, not because she didn't love him, but because she wasn't able to resist the persuasion of family and friends. Henrietta Musgrove is yet another daughter of the Musgroves, and that would be a sister to Charles Musgrove. She also is single, so she also is part of the question of who will make a good match for her. Again, because she comes from a certain level of status, though not as high, of course, as the Elliot family. She's being courted by that cousin, Charles Hayter, who doesn't have title and also is entering into the clergy, so he might be a suitable match because of that. It seems that the Musgroves are a lot less interested in appearances and good matches than the Elliots are, which shows a contrast between the two families. So when Anne is able to spend more time with the Musgroves, she's really able to open up and really critique the society into which she's been born. There is also a Mrs. Clay. No title here, just a Mrs. And think of the last name Clay. Clay is something that you can mold, something that is shifty. So if you haven't gotten to the ending of the novel, I'm not going to give away the spoilers right now, but I can tell you that the surname serves her character well. And she is the oldest daughter's friend. And she is also the daughter to the family attorney, Mr. Shepherd. So this is how they all know one another. And she's spending a lot of time with the Elliot family. And the question that's going on is, could Sir Walter court and even marry her, even though she doesn't have status? And what could that mean to the inheritance? There's Mrs. Smith, again, someone without title and with a very common surname, Smith, which we will be introduced to later, or whom we will be introduced to later in the novel. This is also another widow. Keep in mind, this was not a society where you could easily divorce. And this was a society with a good amount of sickness as well. So you've got people who are married, you've got people who are widowed, and then you've got people who are searching for their match, so to speak. This friend of Anne's, Anne had met when they were in school, is a widow, but this is a widow who is poverty stricken because it seems that even though there were no heirs, there was also no money. So at the ending, she's basically left destitute, and as a woman doesn't have a lot of power or control for herself. And she's also got some health issues now, just to exacerbate the situation in which she's in. And then there's the Mrs. Croft, who's married to the Admiral Croft, who is renting out Kellynch Hall. And the Mrs. Croft is Frederick Croft's sister. And again, the Croft relationship is surprisingly modern. And then if you could see with some miscellaneous characters that I've got laid out, there is a Viscountess Dalrymple, which we will be introduced to, or whom we will be introduced to later in the novel. This is a relative of Sir Walter's. When we are introduced to the Viscountess, this will be the first time that Sir Walter has to interact with somebody who is a higher status than himself. At this point, he's interacting with people who are of comparable or lower status and is acting accordingly. And then, of course, as I had mentioned, a Mr. Shepherd, who is the family attorney. So Persuasion is divided up into two volumes, Volume 1 and Volume 2, which I thought I would talk about next class, though you can see in the notes below that I've got that. And we'll put some closure onto Persuasion. And what I wanted to do was to ask for your attendance question to return back to the idea of paper number 1 as we began today's class. And the question is, what text do you think you would write paper number 1 about, and why? And at this point, it would be either The Story of an Hour, or it would be Frankenstein, or it would be Persuasion. And the tentative due date, notice I'm saying tentative, for that would be a week from today. So that would be next Thursday. I'm trying to see here if I've got the date listed. I believe I do. The 16th. So that would be paper number 1. Now, my deadlines are rolling deadlines, which means you can hand in the paper after that date. But do know that that would put us past halfway through the semester. You can also hand in the paper before that date. And you can also submit in drafts before that date, and I can give you some feedback. Very general feedback, but feedback nonetheless. And if you'll remember, the last class we had reviewed how to write a paper, and I had also uploaded a handout about how to write a paper into our syllabus and other documents folder, which you'll want to review and make sure that you are following those criteria when you're writing your paper. That said, everybody has the option of rewriting paper number 1, because I see paper number 1 as a kind of learning exercise. So that said, when you submit in paper number 1, and I ask that you submit it via PDF to my email, because that's how my grading program works best, which would be Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. Then I will evaluate it, and then I will return it back to you. Next class, I'll talk a little bit about some of the grading criteria. That was also a sheet that was included in your syllabus and other documents folder. And if you are content with the grade that you've earned for that paper, then you're done with the exercise. But everybody has the option of rewriting that paper for a higher grade. I just ask that you submit in the original with my commentary on it, along with the revision, so I can compare and contrast the two. And you would have until the ending of the semester to do that. But of course, the sooner you hand it in, the better for everybody involved. But you would have until the ending of the semester. But as you know, this is a condensed class, so we will, before you know it, be heading into July, which is when our class ends. So I encourage you to catch up with reading if you've fallen behind. What would be ideal is if you finished up Persuasion, so that you can think about whether or not you're going to be writing your paper about Persuasion or Frankenstein, or perhaps A Story of an Hour, and that you are beginning to read Jane Eyre. And again, Jane Eyre is a long read, but I can tell you that I think you'll find it to be a much easier read than Persuasion. The action moves much more quickly, and I think that the perspective we're getting is one that feels a lot more human and real than what we get from the Elliot family, which is so concerned with maintaining status and authority in society. So, not to say that Anne is like her family, but yet even still, she's a product of her society. We had talked about how Mary Shelley ultimately was a product of her society with Frankenstein. So we see a very Eurocentric and a very Christian-centric approach to her writing. And we will see something similar with Persuasion and with the character of Anne Elliot, but Anne isn't nearly as vacuous and as superficial as her other family members. So she's rather progressive in that respect. And I can tell you, by the time we get to the ending of the semester, we will definitely have strong, progressive female voices. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and I look forward to hearing what you're thinking about writing your paper about. Take care, and next class we'll talk about Persuasion. Bye-bye.